If you are talking to me, Patty, unfortunately, I think you're on mute.
No, I'm just muttering, Jared.
Also totally fine. I get it. Yep.
Kidoki. Who can share? Host and panelists. Search host and panelists. Multiple panelists can share simultaneously. Still no joy, Jared, if you try.
No, it's let me show you what I'm seeing. I'll pop it in the chat. If it lets me. Nope, it sure doesn't, but it says the host start. You cannot start the video because the host has stopped it.
She logged in with the email address that
Jared is asking if you've logged in with the same email address that your Teams account is with. Is that right, T? Is that what we're looking for?
that we communicated with. So I think it
That's a great point. Let's see. So whatever you had sent it to, the Jaredith one is the one that I did log in from.
okay. And what does it say when you're trying to share?
It says, not when I try to share, but my video. So let me see.
Oh,
Looks like we can share just fine. So
whoop, there's your email. Sorry about your video. I think that might, I'm not totally sure how to fix that. We can ask you to turn your video on. But it's not, so normally I would have a button that says ask your panelist to turn their video on, but that's missing. So I'm wondering if it's something to do with your software version. I don't know, but we can see your screen.
Perfect. That's the most important thing anyway.
yeah.
Okay. Fabulous. How many people do we have joining us today? Do you know?
You are currently at 30, Jared. As always with these things, people come back late from lunch. So that I'm sure there will be a few more trickle in. So yeah, I'm just trying to think if there's anything else we can do for you to try, Jared. And there's nothing I can think of.
It's the joys and the banes of technology, honestly.
Always the way. Okay, let me just check. Going, that's fine. Okay. All right. That's that. Excuse me. Jared, I'll kind of leave it to you, really. Do you want to get started? Do you want to give it a little bit more time? Oh, no. What's that? The Newman Trust will, yeah, we'll do that. We'll do that in a sec. I'll do it now, actually. So yeah, Newman Trust guys, some of you guys forgive us. I know I sound like a broken record. I know some of you guys have heard me say this a couple of times now if you've been on these ones. I think we are currently up to, let me have a quick look, because this is always good to know, isn't it? So we had, do that again. So you lovely people who have been donating to the Newman Trust, we currently have £405 donated. Tier had set a target of 500. So if anyone hasn't, please do, or if you'll do at the end of the day, that would be amazing. £300 is roughly what it costs for one child's holiday for the week. So you've already sent somebody away for the week. So that's amazing. Thank you very much. And anything else more that people can do, if anyone hasn't, would be absolutely incredible. They really are a super charity. Poonam has just put the link in the chat. If anyone hasn't done that yet, like I say, if you get a moment, please do. It's really easy to follow the link and get that all done. Meredith, what do you think? Do you want to get started?
I say let's do it.
I say let's do it. Meredith, I'll let you introduce yourself, etc. But thank you so much for I've never seen a presentation title like it. So we're really, really looking forward to it. Without much further ado, just quickly, people asking about CEUs, we will put a link up at the end. There's going to be two words that Meredith mentioned in this presentation. Meredith will alert you to that when she gives them. Poonam will send a link out at the end, and we'll also get a QR code up that people can scan. You must put your email address as well as the two correct answers in there, so Tia knows where to send those CEUs. For now, please do use the chat function. We have Poonam with us today who will kind of coordinate all of that. So any questions, go in the Q&A if possible. Any comments and kind of any of the rest of it, please use the chat function. But anyway, without much further ado, Meredith, over to you.
Thank you so much. And I love that we started with that. Not only such a wonderful charity organization to start with, but I appreciate us kind of setting the stage for interactions. This is a really heavy topic, and at least part of this is probably going to be new for some of you. So I highly encourage you to ask questions as you have them. Team, please don't feel bad about interrupting me. Take them as we get them. But without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and get started. So stalking and domestic violence, a perpetrator's perspective. So just kicking us off, as Patty said, my name is Meredith Lord. I am a licensed clinical professional counselor and a board certified behavior analyst. I currently work at a few different locations, including the behavior clinic out in Cardiff. Shout out to their presentation earlier. I work at a couple of clinics here stateside, and then I'm a professor at Endicott College and Southern New Hampshire University. I have spent most of my career working with survivors of trauma. I specifically focus on individuals who have survived domestic violence and military sexual trauma. But today we're going to discuss domestic violence from a bit of a different perspective, and that's going to be that of the perpetrator. I want to start first and foremost with any trigger warnings. Obviously, today has probably been a very heavy day for a lot of people, and I really appreciate you rallying and coming out for this final session. We are not here to solicit perpetrator support. Ultimately, though, if we don't understand the contingencies that contribute to the perpetuation of domestic violence and stalking, the cycle is doomed to continue. Now, I had sent out some pre-work last week. I really hope you had a chance to watch the episode. I hope you found it as fascinating as I did. I was enthralled, and it was, I think, a really interesting insight to what this can look like from a perpetrator perspective. But in case you didn't, just make sure you have that synopsis in front of you. You may miss some critical pieces if you don't. Patty, I'm not sure if we're able to link that in the chat as well, just in case people aren't able to get that in their email, but it'll give you a nice timeline of our case study for the day. And as I said before, I invite you to ask questions in the chat as we progress. I would love for this to be as interactive as possible. So a couple of objectives today. First, we're going to discuss rule-governed behavior versus contingency-governed behavior as it pertains to perpetrator behavior. Typically, when we discuss domestic violence or stalking, we really heavily focus on that contingency-governed behavior. But in reality, it's twofold, and it's important that both of these components are considered when we start to cultivate legislation to protect survivors and when we start to cultivate interventions to address these behaviors. Objective 2, we're going to identify the reinforcements and punishments that may contribute to the perpetuation of domestic violence and stalking, both initially and continued. And then finally, we're going to offer some special considerations for practitioners working with these high-risk populations. We're kind of going to give an overview of these considerations, but then also intervention directions. And hopefully that acts as a guidance for not only our behaviorists in the audience, but really anybody who's in that helping agency context. So I want to start with some common misconceptions about stalking and domestic violence. These are, when I looked through these, essentially, I went on the internet and looked up these common misconceptions and pulled from a couple of different sites and listed the most frequent ones that I saw. Starting with domestic violence, I apologize, these seem to be flipped. Starting with domestic violence, a common myth is that it only happens in low-income families, that it is caused by alcohol and drugs. We know that substances can act as a catalyst for some problem behaviors, but it is not in any capacity fair to blame alcohol and drugs for it. That the cycle of domestic violence continues due to the perpetrator's low self-esteem. Self-esteem is, again, very similar to alcohol and drugs, not a scapegoat for these problem behaviors. The one that I saw pretty frequently is that you cannot rape someone that you're in a relationship with, which was extremely jarring, but as I said, very frequently seen across multiple messenger boards. And then finally, abusers are only abused because they were at one time abused. Switching to that other side of stalking, only celebrities are stalked. If you ignore stalking, it'll go away. Stalking is creepy, but it's not dangerous. Stalking is annoying, but not illegal. And then finally, you can't be stalked by someone so you're still dating. Obviously, I'm going to let you guys have a moment and have these all sink in, but realistically, these are very common misconceptions and ultimately contribute to the prevention of an appropriate intervention for individuals who display these behaviors. So when we consider, like, you can't rape someone you're in a relationship with, then that kind of shuts down not only any intervention, but any prevention work. It's wrong in and of itself, but it starts to cultivate an attitude and a stigma against individuals who report sexual assault against their partners. And we start right back at the beginning. You're going to see this a couple of times throughout this presentation where we talk about an opportunity for law enforcement intervention or community intervention that just didn't happen. And when it didn't happen, it led to lethality. So I want you to really, really take this in, because when we perpetuate these misconceptions, this is where we start to see a breakdown of these interventions. So I'd like to introduce our case study for today, Mr. Daniel Thompson. I asked you, as I said, to complete some pre-work for this session. I understand that many of you have not had the opportunity to review it, so I'm going to give you a brief overview of our subject. There's a synopsis. I'm going to ask you to review that more in detail, and this is going to be really important when we start to discuss the details of his patterns of behavior. I've also included a timeline to demonstrate Daniel's patterns. On the synopsis, you'll notice that there's a pretty significant gap in behaviors from 2000 to 2007. And frankly, this is when Daniel was incarcerated. So we didn't see any reportable behaviors because of that reason. So in a nutshell, Daniel Thompson grew up in small town America with no apparent exposure to violence. As per his own admission, there's no history of family violence, no child abuse. He is not gang affiliated. He has a pretty normal childhood, so to speak, advising he goes to summer camps, helps out on the family farm, so on and so forth. He does note that he struggles to maintain relationships with his peers due to his diagnosis of pervasive developmental disorder. He uses this as a pretty recurrent explanation for his behaviors with his interpersonal partnership. We're going to get into a little bit later how this acts almost as Daniel's rule-governed foundation. But for those of us who perhaps are not super familiar with pervasive developmental disorder, it is reclassified as part of autism spectrum disorder. DSM-5 went ahead and lumped those together. For those of us who don't work with individuals with autism, common diagnostic features include impairment in social communication and social interaction, and then restricted/repetitive patterns of behavior or interest or activities. Bottom line in this, though, there is absolutely no inclusion criteria that presumes violence, not in autism spectrum disorder and not in pervasive developmental disorder. So you'll hear PDD come up quite a few times, and this is Daniel's rule. This is not founded on a diagnostic criteria. So continuing on with his case study, there are multiple incidences of stalking and violence directed at multiple victims. This case study is going to actually focus on 3 of his victims, but upon further analysis of police reports across his lifespan, we see that there's several more individuals who experienced not only his stalking tendencies, but his violent ones. These are just the 3 that had the most lethal results. All 3 women interviewed report being followed, harassed, and physically assaulted. Throughout this presentation, I really want you to please keep your eyes open for the escalation of behaviors and the intensity of that extinction burst. Before we get too deep in the weeds, I want to give you your first CEU verification word. This word is Ariel. Just a fun fact for you to lighten the mood. She was my favorite Disney princess. As an adult, I can see why her dad was upset with a lot of her life choices, but that's okay. As a child, she was my favorite. So your first CEU verification word of the day is Ariel. So let's jump into some definitions of stalking and domestic violence. So as I mentioned, we're introducing today an adjacent behavior to domestic violence. We don't typically lump stalking in with violence. And to be honest, that's rather unfortunate because we see such a strong correlation between those 2 behaviors. Stalking is defined as repeated following, communicating, and contacting a person in a threatening manner that causes the person to fear on a reasonable basis for his or her safety. Some not so fun facts about stalking. The majority of stalking victims are stalked by someone they know. Most victims are stalked by a current or former intimate partner or by an acquaintance. I think stalking really gets this negative persona that it's just between lovers or ex-lovers, but I can tell you that in my professional capacity, I've absolutely seen it between friends, friends that have decided to end their friendship, and then one friend cannot handle that. And that is just as scary and just as valid. The average length of partner stalking is about 2.5 years. 31% of women stalked by an intimate partner are also sexually assaulted. And 46% of victims experience 1 or more violent incidences by their stalkers. I've separated those 2 statistics because I don't want them to be lumped together. So specifically saying 31% of women are reporting sexual assault, 46% of overall victims are experiencing some other form of physical violence. And then finally, 76% of intimate partner femicide victims have been stalked by their intimate partner. 54% of these victims reported that stalking to police. This is not a situation where people are being stalked in private and keeping that secret. They're making the reports. They're reaching out for help. The legislation that we have in place, though, makes it very, very difficult to prove stalking. And that's not just the UK, and that's not just America. That's across the board. I can tell you that when someone experiences domestic violence, there is sometimes proof, so to speak. There's sometimes a bruise. There's sometimes a mark. With stalking, it's less likely that there is going to be that mark. And that makes it very difficult to prove. And as a result, we see a lot of individuals see that escalation before their concerns are taken seriously. I also want to note that a lot of these statistics are geared towards women. Men are just as likely to be stalked. We just see that in a difference of reporting tendencies. Men tend not to report stalking. Jumping over to domestic violence, when we operationally define domestic violence, I like to do it as 4 separate components. So I'm a military spouse. I really like the Department of Defense definitions, and that focuses on these 4 components that include physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, and neglect. So physical abuse is any physical contact initiated by one partner to another that results in an unwanted injury, pain, or degradation. These injuries can be present on any part of the body, and they may include bruising, bleeding, marks, imprints on the skin, broken bones. They don't have to. I have seen plenty of survivors come forward where they don't have a physical mark, and that doesn't make their physical abuse any less valid. An example of physical abuse may include one partner smacking the other partner in the face, resulting in a red mark. But a non-example of physical abuse would be consensual BDSM, which can result in pain, but is not non-consensual. So you see how it starts to get very gray, and that's why this communication is very important for individuals who engage in BDSM. Emotional abuse would include belittling, threatening, coercing, or controlling one partner by another that ultimately results in that power differentiation between them. So one partner makes the decision and another partner doesn't have that equal input. Emotional abuse can include words, threats, or tone to indicate impending punishment. It can also include acts in which one partner throws objects, so not necessarily at their partner, but near them, or when they brandish items that could be considered a weapon, since both of these actions are rooted in intimidation. I can tell you that with the individuals I served, time and time again, you would hear people say, I don't go in the kitchen. And that's not for the knives, and that's not for the scissors that are in the kitchen. But at a certain point, it's threatening enough to be threatened with a frying pan or a cutting board. Anything can be used as intimidation. Examples of this may be demeaning one's partner by calling them stupid, which is a punishing term, obviously, that reduces the likelihood that the other partner will speak up. But a non-example of this may also be one partner calling another's decision stupid, but this is a mutual understanding that this is a joke within their rule-governed behavior that exists between the couple. So as you can see, emotional abuse is really, really difficult to verify. Sexual abuse is any physical contact, including groping, fondling, and oral, vaginal, anal penetration that is enacted by one partner without the consent of another partner, or while that other partner is in a state of duress or incapacitation. And that includes whether or not the act is completed. The most obvious example of this is when one partner rapes the other. And then finally, neglect. Neglect is normally reserved for the lack of care provided to the children in the household or the elderly, but neglect in an intimate partnership may also involve availability of resources. So you see one partner withholding access from their other partner to healthcare or sustenance or adequate shelter, clothing, or hygiene. An example of neglect would be one partner holding another's identification, so they're unable to access transportation or medical care. But then a non-example would be one partner holding the other's driver's license when requested to do so for a specific period of time. So I use the example, I don't like to carry my purse. I'll have my husband carry my driver's license whenever we go anywhere. But the stipulation being you will hold my license while we're in the vehicle, while we're in the store, and then return it to me upon returning home. And that would be the non-example versus if he removed it from me and refused to return it. So I would like to revisit our case study at this time. Going back to Danielle Thompson, I mentioned that I was going to create this pretty little timeline for you, and it really shows this accumulation of behaviors over 20 years. So he meets the love of his life in high school in 1991, and ultimately all of his behaviors are cultivated into a conviction of murder in 2011, where he is still located. The controlling behaviors, as you can see from this timeline, start very early and they escalate to physical violence. So again, starting with Angie, this is what prevented Angie from leaving him. And that's something Daniel really views as the ultimate punishment. This escalates further when Angie does leave him. And we see that in that 1996-2000 range. Daniel's behaviors with Angie could have resulted in her death. And that's 100% certain. When Angie moves in with her new boyfriend, she discovers that Dan has broken into her house with gloves, plastic bags, and a knife. She wholeheartedly believes that this was to murder her. Fortunately, as you saw in the case study in the video, Angie calls the police and the police come. And in that moment, we see that the punishment of going to jail exceeds her emotional punishment of Daniel, which is ultimately what saves her life. The relationship with Jennifer, that second victim, progresses similarly. Her punishing him, and I say that with some form of quotation because that's Dan's perception. Her punishment of him by ending the relationship results in physical violence. Remember, Dan says he didn't kill Angie, so in theory, she won. Those were the words that he used. His intent was to kill Jennifer, but she stabs him first. And again, that punishment is significantly worse than the punishment of her leaving him. One of the things I like to note in the case of Jennifer is that there's no legal punishment here. Dan is apprehended, he's charged, and he's released on probation. But since he's not going to jail and there's no real ramification for his actions, this kind of serves as reinforcement in and of itself. Finally, we see this relationship with Jane Doe. Jane is an individual who wishes to keep her identity a secret, respectfully so. Their relationship begins and ends within 3 months. So it's very casual. They never lived together, just 3 months, but she ends it. Dan sees this as going the same as his past relationship. He sees this as a pattern. So he breaks into her house to kill her. Unfortunately, or fortunately, or maybe a mix of both, he accidentally stabs her partner. He's convicted of murder and he's sentenced to 30 years, which is where he is today. So I just want to note a couple of disturbing facts about this case study. Throughout his life, Dan is actually charged with 13 felonies. And if you're not an American and you're not familiar with the American penal system, like felonies are like our big boy charges, right? You got your misdemeanors, you got your felonies. Felonies are a big deal. You lose your voting rights, you lose your right to own weapons, you lose the ability to hold a job. So they're not taken lightly. He's only actually ever convicted with 5. In his words, I am always able to get out of it. I can do whatever I want and get away with it. So we see this bravado building with every sense of reinforcement in that he's not sent to jail. This case study is the ultimate example of the potential lethality of an extinction burst. These women withdrew their reinforcement, which we'll call it love, if that's the most appropriate thing to refer to it as, but withdrew their reinforcement, and therefore Daniel's behavior escalated. So I want to jump into what ultimately governs these behaviors. I had mentioned in the beginning that when we look at behavior, we look at contingency governed behaviors and then rule governed behaviors. So contingency governed behaviors, we know these to be behavior that is influenced by coming in direct contact with a reinforcer or punishment. If I touch a hot stove, it burns my hand. I'm not going to touch a hot stove in the future. That's not nice. In Dan's case, we see reinforcement in the form of affection from these women. Their withdrawal of affection is viewed as that punishment. So when Dan becomes threatening or violent, these women stop pulling away. Honestly, most likely as a way to keep themselves safe, right? But this pattern continues until Dan escalates to a point that the punishment associated with continuing the relationship is worse than the reinforcement associated with continuing the relationship. So again, going to prison is worse in his eyes than continuing the relationship. Being stabbed is a pretty big one associated with or against continuing the relationship. The rule governed behavior on the other side, this is behavior that is under the control of verbally mediated rules. So my example is I look both ways before I cross the street, even though I've never been hit by a bus. But my mama told me to look both ways, so I do it. To some degree, I think we see an example of rule-governed behavior in Dan's diagnosis of PDD as a child. He cites this several times as a reason to why these breakups are not manageable, and honestly, why his violence is excusable. This is my note to say that individuals with PDD or autism they have their own unique struggles. I'm not minimizing that in the least, but Dan uses this as a specific rule for why his behavior is acceptable. And as we discussed in that criteria earlier, that's not the case. Separate from this case study, we also see rule-governed behavior act as a catalyst for some domestic violence when cultivated by some cultural values. So this is stepping out of our case study. We've seen it in some Middle Eastern cultures that value men as the sole authority in their home. We've seen it in Mexican machismo, that, kind of overbearing attitude to anybody in a position perceived as inferior. I've been in Florida for 3 weeks, guys. We've seen it in the American alpha male. And again, all of these tend to be at the expense of an intimate partner or a perceived inferior person. And they're all done without the typical abusive learning history that we have correlated with violence. So these are not people who have grown up in a very violent situation and are perpetuating behaviors that they learned as children. These are individuals operating under a rule. They believe that they are superior and therefore they need to act in a certain way. Maintaining these behaviors, so domestic violence and stalking both follow patterns of gradual escalation. The victim often doesn't recognize the risk until it is way too late to safely exit. I mean, and we think about that. If somebody entered a relationship and that first night, their arm was broken by their partner, it's pretty cut and dry. We'd leave, right? The end. But that's not how it starts. It starts with these mini cuts. It starts with controlling behaviors. It starts with isolation. My mentor once described it as the metaphorical frog in a boiling pot, where we really don't realize the water's boiling until it's too late to get out of that pot. Stalking may be viewed as caring or protective. Domestic violence can be minimized or counterbalanced with love bombing or the honeymoon phase. We see that with Angie. So she describes when she and Dan are dating as teenagers, and she would wake up and he would be standing over her bed watching her sleep because he had snuck through her parents' doggy door. At the time, she's like, oh, that's so romantic. He really cares about me. And in hindsight, we look at that, and that's a major red flag. That's not even a beige flag. That's a very red flag. Early behaviors for both of these, domestic violence and stalking, are reinforced by the perpetrator maintaining control. They maintain the continued attention from their partner, along with the control over the partner themselves. Their intimate partner starts to actually take on that role of a possession rather than an equal. So we see it shift from attention or escape maintain behaviors to almost a tangible. Yeah, I think that's the easiest way to describe it. The continued behaviors as the partner begins to recognize the situation for what it is. Perpetrators often feel the need to increase the violence or their presence to maintain this control. And again, this is that frog in the boiling water. So jumping back to our case study, I had mentioned Angie and how she'd awake to him standing above her bed. Later on, as she starts to realize that these behaviors are extremely toxic, Dan starts to amplify the intensity of his violence. So starting with watching her sleep, ending with knives to her throat. If that wasn't heavy enough for you and you don't need a break, then just, take one with me just for the sake of it. This is our second CEU verification word. Also a reminder that if anything stands out to you, please feel free to pop it in the chat. We'll answer it in real time, but your second CEU verification word of the day is going to be flounder, kind of keeping with the theme of Ariel, or a delicious fish to eat, whichever you prefer. Both are supported. Flounder. So a couple of special considerations that I really want to foot stomp, and then we're going to jump into future directions. First, starting with mental health. We sometimes see domestic violence and stalking correlated with mental health disorders. There's some research to indicate a correlation between these two behavioral patterns and personality disorders, substance use disorders, mood disorders, and psychotic disorders. I mean, as has been stated, Dan blamed his behaviors on his PDD. So yeah, just food for thought there. At the end of the day, mental health is not the cause of domestic violence or stalking. I cannot understate that enough. Correlation does not equal causation. That is a full stop. Perhaps some behaviors can be exacerbated by substance use. But if we're just targeting the substance use in this situation, and that's just one example, then we really fail to see the root cause of these behaviors. We fail to see the function. Attachment and learning history may have a greater influence on the development of violent behaviors, more so than mental health. So there is a stronger link between violence as an exaggerated response of a disorganized attachment system. It is related to a disorganized attachment pattern, perhaps in infancy, coupled with a history of abuse and absent parental figures. Again, this is research that will need to be cultivated over decades, and it's in its infancy at this point. But we still see domestic violence and stalking occur for individuals who have not had that learning history. Again, with Daniel, he claims his childhood was perfect. So just food for thought when working with this population. Future directions for you. There are a couple of intervention options for offenders of domestic violence and stalking. We'll start with some psychological interventions, since I know our audience is pretty diverse today. First, we have dialectical behavior therapy that really focuses on emotional control. We have cognitive behavioral therapy, which is focused on that anger management, impulsivity aspect. And then we have R&R. So backtracking to DBT and CBT, both empirically valid, both good options. They can be used as a preventative method for individuals kind of showing a tendency towards these violent behaviors, or they can be used as an intervention on the reactivity side. R&R is a recidivism targeted framework. So it can be used in conjunction with DBT and CBT, but it really only exists once a violent incident has occurred. So R&R is the risk needs responsivity model. Risk refers to the intensity of treatment to match the level of risk that individual may pose to others or themselves. N is needs related to recidivism, such as substance use or unemployment, which again have been correlated in some perpetrators. And then finally, responsivity involves matching the most appropriate form of treatment to the offender's characteristics and circumstances. Now, again, R&R can be used in conjunction with DBT, CBT, or even skills-based training. A lot of it is going to be based on the individual's environment. So can this be done in the community? Can this be done at home, at a center, or even prison? So just important things to consider. From a behavioral perspective, we see the most evidence for skills-based training, and skills training specifically in verbal skills, social skills, conflict resolution, problem solving, reasoning, and problems with emotional regulation. All of these are coupled with a cost-benefit analysis for positive reinforcement of healthy non-stalking behaviors. So how do we respond when a loved one rejects us? How do we respond when we're feeling lonely and we don't know what to do with those emotions? And again, this isn't supporting perpetrator behaviors, but when we start to understand the functions that may underline a lot of their behaviors, that's when we can cultivate an appropriate intervention. So that brings us to our conclusion. Oh, I am right on time. I'm loving this. Just wanted to highlight some key takeaways for you. So stalking follows the same escalation of behaviors that we see in domestic violence. It has an extremely high risk of lethality, and it should be taken extremely seriously. Unfortunately, because it is so difficult to prove and because it is not always lumped in with the same risk factors as domestic violence, it's not always taken seriously. Behaviorally, stalking and domestic violence follow the amplification that is often seen in extinction bursts. While mental health has a loose correlation to the development of these problem behaviors, it cannot and should not be the scapegoat. And then finally, a better understanding of stalking and domestic violence can be gleaned by examining the contingency and rule-governed nature of these behaviors, along with any punishments and reinforcements that are contributing to their maintenance. I appreciate y'all's time today. That is the conclusion of my presentation, and I hope that, you know, some of you will stick around and we'll have an engaging conversation on the content. If you have questions, comments, or statements, you're also invited to message me directly, and that's at jlord1@endicott.edu or via LinkedIn. I'm happy to have these conversations. I'm happy to promote this topic further. But otherwise, thank you so much for your time today, and I hope this was informative for you.
Wow, Meredith, that was incredible. That was incredible. Thank you very much. To the audience members, give us a shout. We haven't had any questions come through yet, but if people do want to raise a question, we can link you into the conversation. So we figured out how to kind of allow people to talk if anybody does want to ask Meredith a question directly. And whilst we are waiting, we've got plenty of kind of great presentation. This is incredible, you know, that kind of stuff coming through, Meredith. I was just curious, kind of whilst we're perhaps letting the audience have a think about some of their questions. Mentioning that SBT appears to be the kind of most effective treatment option at the moment, Meredith. Just wondering if you can expand a little bit. You kind of gave a little bit of an insight as into kind of what that might constitute. Can you just give us a little bit more kind of example of what an SBT program might contain, might look like for folks?
Absolutely. So one of the things that lends to the effectiveness of an SBT-based program is that it's pretty diverse, right? We can tailor it to those individuals' needs. So if we're seeing, and I'm not saying this to minimize any types of behaviors, but if we're seeing like low-lying stalking behaviors, can we identify the function of those behaviors as a communication deficit? And can we focus on those? It would obviously start with that functional assessment, be that formal or informal. And then from there, creating a tailored intervention that allows us to target those behaviors. Now, once we start to reach levels where there's risk of violence or there's even a risk of lethality, oftentimes our environment has changed. Oftentimes these skills-based training are actually taking place in prison systems or intensive outpatient programs from a penal system. And we see a change in that. So those skills-based training are going to be coupled, I hesitate to say this, but stay with me, with almost a punishment procedure where it's reinforcing, hey, you want to stay out of prison, you want to work towards coming out of prison. How can we do that in a way that keeps you safe? Because we don't want you to go back. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. And it's highly individualized and dependent on that individual's motivation.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Meredith. Okay, we have one from Georgie. Thank you, Georgie. How do we change the contingency trajectory when there is often not adequate punisher for people who stalk, particularly for people with mild LD? I'm absolutely on board with skills enhancing.
Oh, yeah. Y'all are making me work today. I wish that there was an easy answer for that, right? So I could sit on a soapbox and take another hour of your time talking about how legislation it's not designed to protect survivors. It's really not. In theory, it should be, but because the burden of proof is so high in these situations, it often requires near lethality or lethality for that individual to contact that punishment. So we don't see it for we don't see it for a perpetrator who's showing up outside of their victim's house 30 times a day. Even with Ring cameras, even with evidence from witnesses, they're not punished for that. It's only after they have made that physical assault on their victim. So that's the unfortunate reality. When we look at individuals with LD who are starting to demonstrate these early behaviors, and I emphasize that early intervention is going to be critical. A lot of it comes down to a deficit in skills. So as I said, we're going to start to identify some of those things that can be worked on, and be that communication or emotional regulation or impulse control. It really starts with that functional assessment to make sure we're understanding that. And then providing them a safe place where they can practice those skills too. So I'm sure many of us can speak to examples that they have seen working with their clientele that perhaps the intention is well-meaning, but the execution is not. And I think of learners that I've worked with that perhaps are very handsy, as an example. And their intention is not to violate anybody else's boundaries, but they have not quite learned how to communicate that they want a hug or they want the interaction. So it's really targeting those hyper-specific skills and not reinforcing patterns of behavior that ultimately could lead to stalking or domestic violence.
Lovely. Thanks, Sheridan. We have another from anonymous attendee. So some have used a behavioural economics model regarding domestic violence. For example, the problems with leaving a violent relationship due to the cost of finding a new home, income source, etc. Are you seeing any examples of behavioural economics in the phenomenon of stalking? Is the stalking behaviour being reinforced by elements in the environment?
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, I love this question. Thank you so much. So we see it as, we can look at it as a cost benefit analysis, right? We can look at it as a emotional benefit to the perpetrator because they have that element of control. They know where their victim goes, who they're with, what they're doing. And then they start to, as I had said in the presentation, assign the victim a tangible property. So you are mine, and I am going to know where you're at all times. For the victim, remind me, I'll circle back to victim and survivor mentality because that's an important point too. But for that individual who is being stalked, we see a huge cost. So let's presume that that individual has never been physically hurt. They've the stalker has never actually, made contact. It's just that constant anxiety and constant wear on their mental health. We see individuals who are stalked often are unable to keep jobs because they're not able to sleep at night, or because they need anxiety medication that is so high, it makes it difficult for them to function at work. Without a job, how are they going to have healthcare? How are they going to have a home? Perhaps they're able to keep their job and then they're forced to move 2, 3, 4 times. But I'm going to be honest, it is so easy to figure out where y'all live. And I don't mean that as a low-lying threat. I mean that as a fact. You go on Google, and I'm just going to pick a name here from our participants. Christina Aston, if I Google you, I bet I can find where you live. And again, not a threat, but wholeheartedly, it's easy. It's very easy.
Yeah.
And I wanted to bring up that victim versus survivor mentality. So we are all taught when we go into this field that individuals who have been through these horrific experiences are survivors. They are the upper echelon of survivor because they've been through so much, and that is what they deserve to be called. And I 100% agree with you. But I will say that many people who have survived stalking and domestic violence don't like to be referred to as a survivor because it makes them feel like they had an active role in this situation. They had an active role in being stalked. They, especially when I worked with stalking, people who survived stalking, they say, no, I was a victim. I wanted help. I wanted the support, and it didn't come. So they didn't overcome it. they were subject to it, and they want others to know about it so that they are not subject to it as well.
Wow. So is that in terms of kind of, I suppose the label of people would in some circumstances prefer victim to survivor, Jeremy?
Yes, sir. And honestly, it's a mimicry game. Whatever they refer to themselves as, I do too.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. My goodness. I think that wraps up the questions for now. Meredith, look, thank you so much. Every time you come and do something for us, it's really interesting. Gives us a new perspective, but also just another example of kind of what's possible through these kind of behaviourally analytic lens and perspective. So thank you so much for doing that. Thank you. Oh, hang on a sec. We do look like we've had someone else. Compassion first, PBS and commitment in case of the call to action. Okay, sorry. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely incredible. And thank you for putting your LinkedIn in there as well, Meredith. That's really helpful. We will put the link for the CEUs in here now. Poonam will do that for everybody. Excuse me, but Meredith, as always, thank you so much for a really genuinely fascinating presentation, and also thank you because it's quite brave doing it from the perspective that you have. It's unusual, quite uncommon, I would imagine, and I think it's just really added to kind of how thought-provoking it's been. I'm really grateful to you. Thank you so much.
I appreciate that. When I brought it to Tia, I was like, hey, is this too much? Like, and she's like, nah, let's go for it. So I'm so grateful for all of y'all's support and really just this opportunity. So thank you.
Absolute pleasure. Oh, hang on. We might have one more question if you're up for it, Meredith, by the looks of it. Got Cormac. Hi, Cormac, by the way. Has the strength, quality, length of a relationship that breaks down been a predictor for the likelihood of stalking occurring?
No. Firm and emphatic no. I'd love to say yes, because that would help us predict some of these patterns and therefore intervene. But I have seen stalking behaviors that occur for romantic relationships that break down after 10 years, friendships that break down after 2 years. I have also seen some of the worst stalking incidences that occur after two people going on a date and then texting each other afterwards and being like, hey, thank you so much. This really wasn't my vibe. So there is across the board strength, quality, length of the relationship does not have that correlation.
I'm not sure this is a particularly good question, but it's the one that's just popped to me. Is there any way for people screening this kind of stuff, Meredith, at all? I mean, I know it's kind of highly, unlikely, but yeah, just any possibility of screening this stuff for people that are getting into new relationships, I suppose.
So this is less scientific of me, but just an observation that I've seen of younger generations who are really on the up and up on what is safe in a relationship. So I really admire them. Instagram and TikTok make it an almost joking matter where they're like red flag, beige flag. But in reality, we see these younger generations saying like, you're love bombing me, or no, this is my personal time and I don't like this. So not a screening, but pretty heavy-handed boundaries in the beginning. And I think that's something that I'll even say for like my millennial self. I was told if a boy's mean to me on the playground, it's because he likes me. We are not seeing that rhetoric anymore. And I love that.
It's a good place to finish, I think. Meredith, really, honestly, thank you so much. Really incredible. Absolute pleasure. I can see that people have really enjoyed it. Yeah, been absolutely fascinating. So thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you. Appreciate your time. Please reach out if y'all have any questions or comments, and I look forward to hearing from you soon.
Thanks, Meredith. Yeah, Amy and other people that are asking for that CU link, it's the Revolut link that's been put in there. So if you click on that Revolut link, you should be able to follow that. And it's the same link you can access for kind of all of the presentations. Just a word of warning for some people. I think of a lunchtime. T was mentioning that there might have been a couple of issues with people getting on there. My guess is that's just volume of people doing it all at the same time. If you are struggling, just give yourself a bit of a pause. Maybe do it a little bit later. I'm sorry, that's a touch inconvenient, but it's nothing we can do anything about. We assume it's just because there's so many people trying to do it at the same time. All right. Jared, thanks. Thanks all you attendees, much appreciated. And we will see most of you for the keynote shortly. Thanks, folks.